What the heck is NVIS? And why does it create such controversy? So what's all the controversy about? Well, it's a term that's used and misused a lot. And the issue is that most people are using NVIS and not even realizing it. So if you're communicating on 40 meters during daytime hours and the person you are talking to is less than 700 miles away, you are using NVIS as your mode of propagation. So let's dive in and explain exactly what's happening. The major form of propagation on HF is skywave propagation. And using skywave propagation, signals will bounce around in the ionosphere, which gives us the ability to communicate at farther than line of sight distances. It's a very useful mode of communication. It can be very unpredictable as well. My first experience with skywave was CB, or 11 meter, and I got into CB back in the 80s in the middle of a sunspot cycle, and it was not uncommon to hear stations that were across the country from where my station was in Ohio. So very common to talk to people in Washington State from Ohio, California, South America was very common. 11 meters being what it is, as a very efficient HF band, those were quite commonplace, and it didn't take a lot of power to do it. That's one of the nice things about HF, is the higher you go in frequency, before that maximum usable frequency where the signal just shoots right through the F layer, it can be very efficient. So that was my first experience with skywave propagation. And one of the interesting things about skywave propagation on especially the higher frequency bands that we're capable of using is that you get these quote unquote skip zones where the RF signal will actually go over stations that are on the ground. For instance, it was not uncommon for me to talk to somebody in Washington State from Ohio, and I would not hear any stations in the middle of the country. So Missouri, Nebraska, Minnesota, etc. Those stations were in the middle of the country. They just were, I was not able to hear them. They were not able to hear me. Essentially, the RF signal was going over them. It was in the F layer, or being bounced off the F layer, over their heads, and they could not hear me at all. So that's what we define as a skip zone, and it's the reason you should always ask, is this frequency in use, before starting a QSO? Because there may be stations out there that can hear you, and they're communicating with somebody in a place that you can't hear. So it's always good to say, is this frequency in use? And then proceed giving your call sign, trying to make a QSO. So that's very common on the higher frequency bands, 10 meters, 15 meters, 20 meters, sometimes 6 meters. You get these very large skip zones where your signal travels for long distances in the ionosphere before it comes back down to Earth. And it's very interesting and can be very frustrating. So back to NVIS. NVIS is a concept that was actually created by the military. And the purpose of it was for military organizations to be able to communicate over very short distances to mobile soldiers in the field. And I believe that the first army to use it was the Germans. The US military uses it well. I believe that the US military uses frequencies that are 7 megahertz and lower. And if you've ever seen a military whip on a Humvee, it kind of looks like this. So you have your vehicle, and on the back of the vehicle, they'll have this very long fiberglass whip. It goes way up. They're typically 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 feet long. But When those vehicles wanted to do NVIS communication, what they would do is they would bend that whip over to the front of the vehicle and they would tie it off in the front. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the signal to go straight up in the air. So that's the first rule for NVIS communications is for best signal, you want your antenna to be horizontal. So the antenna itself needs to be horizontal. It doesn't mean if you're using a vertical whip on your car that you can't do NVIS communications, because I hear people daily using various vertical whips on their mobiles, and they're able to communicate on 40 meters in the day at those distances that we've talked about just fine. So it will work, but it isn't the optimum configuration for your antenna. What you want is a horizontally polarized antenna. And there's something else that needs to happen too, and we're going to go into that right now. But first, let's talk about the D layer and the F layer and how it works for us for NVIS. So we have the curvature of the Earth. The ionosphere layers that we're dealing with are the D layer and the F layer. So the D layer is the low one. And it's kind of the enemy of HF communications because it's a sponge. It absorbs RF energy. And then we have the F layer. And the F layer in the middle of the day will move away from the Earth as it gets energized by the sun. And it'll also split into two layers, the F1 and the F2. And these are the main layers that work for us for communications. So you have a signal that comes off of the ground, a ground station, and on a typical skywave, it's going to come through that D layer. Part of it's going to be absorbed, and then the rest of it's going to come up here and it's going to hit this F layer, and it's going to be refracted. Now, it's not going to come straight back down, most likely. Most likely it's going to get kind of tangled up in here and bounce around a little bit, and then it's going to come out at a weird angle and come down. And that's how we get these long communications between stations on 10 meters, 15 meters, 20 meters, etc. So this is our skip zone right in here. If you have a radio on the ground in this area, you're not going to hear squat. You won't hear anything. So that's a skip zone. Now, if you deliberately want to talk to somebody that's closer, that's when we utilize what we've come to know as NVIS. And the only difference with NVIS is we have to use a frequency that's low enough that we can get a direct bounce off of the F layer. And what that takes is it takes a signal that's roughly 8 megahertz or lower. So the two most common bands for NVIS for hams are 40 meters and 80 meters. So you can take a 40 meter or 80 meter signal and you can beam it straight up, or nearly straight up. And because it's going through the D layer, almost straight through it, not much signal is going to get absorbed most of the day. Now around noontime, of course, you can have a 40 meter signal completely absorbed by the D layer. And that's why in the middle of the day, it tends to be less reliable. But then it's going to go up and it's going to hit this same F layer, F1 and F2. And it's going to bounce around only here a little bit, and it's going to get caught up, and it's going to get refracted, and it's going to come down. And typically it can come down very, very close to the transmitting station. In fact, I've heard stations in the middle of the day as close as 90 miles from me on 40 meters. So not line of sight, but still relatively close and able to hold a conversation with those stations that are about 90 to 100 miles away. So in a nutshell, that's NVIS. So then what antenna setups work best for NVIS? Well, let's experiment a little bit. So as I mentioned, horizontal antennas work best. And if you're on 40 meters, like most hams, you're going to have some sort of a dipole up in the air. Maybe a vertical, but most of us start with wire dipoles. They're simple, easy to erect, and work very well. And you're already probably using a very good NVIS antenna. The reason I say that is because your typical NVIS antenna has to be low enough to the ground that the ground acts as a reflector and reflects the signal straight up in the air instead of out along the curvature of the Earth. So ideally, if we wanted to talk to distant stations on 40 meters, you'd want your antenna to be at least half a wavelength up in the air. So I've pulled up an example here with EZ and EC, and you can see that my distance above ground here, I've got it set at 67 feet, which is roughly half of a wavelength on 7 megahertz. And if I do a pattern with this antenna, you can see that it's kind of squashed, got that squashed donut look, kind of bidirectional. And our signal is going, it's radiating outward, not straight up in the air. And our gain down at 5 degrees is pretty decent. This would be a great antenna for talking not to local stations, but to stations that are kind of far away. This is what you're looking for if you want to talk around the globe on 20 meters or 40 meters. In this case, this one's cut for 40 meters. So this antenna is 66 feet long, and it's 67 feet above ground. It's just an end-fed, very simple antenna. As you can see here, we have our main wire, we have our feed point, we have a counterpoise. It's perfectly flat at 67 feet above the ground. So this is a great DX antenna, great for talking to stations that are far, far away. But not very many hams have the ability to get one of these 67 feet in the air. Most of us put these antennas between 20 and 30 feet above ground. So let's change this to 30 feet. And let's run a pattern again and see what the pattern change looks like. Wow, completely different antenna. So now instead of having a squashed donut with most of our RF energy radiating sideways, it looks more like a kind of a squashed golf ball. Most of our energy is going up in the air at 90 degrees from the horizon. And you can see our gain here is at 6.15 dBi gain. So in this case, the ground is acting kind of like the reflector in a Yagi. And it's directing the energy of this antenna straight up in the air. So as it happens, this 30 feet above ground is very close to 1/8 of a wavelength at 7 megahertz. You'll find that this is a very good height above ground for an NVIS antenna for local communications, about 1/8 of a wavelength. But 1/8 of a wavelength on 7 megahertz is 30-ish feet. And the two bands available for, well, there's more than two bands available, but the two major bands available for NVIS in the United States are 40 meters and 80 meters. And 1/8 of a wavelength on 80 meters is going to be back up there around 67 feet. So clearly, height matters. And the problem is if you get too low, the gain is going to start dropping. So once again, this antenna at 1/8 of a wavelength above ground is just a bit over 6 dBi. But what if we drop this to 15 feet? So same antenna, now at 15 feet above ground instead of 30 feet. And we'll run the plot again. And now you can see that our gain, although our pattern is still at 90 degrees, nothing wrong there, but our gain is starting to drop. The ground is starting to absorb our signal. We're down to 4.8 dBi. So this is the problem with getting it too low. The lower you get, the less gain this antenna is going to have. It will also lose bandwidth. It will be narrow banded compared to an antenna that's an 1/8 wavelength. So here's the same antenna at 6 feet above ground, which some will recommend for an NVIS antenna. And it looks more and more like a golf ball the lower you get. but look at our gain. So we're actually at negative gain, negative 0.45 dBi. Very low gain. And that's going to be a problem. Yes, it will work. And it will actually be a very quiet antenna. The lower you get to the ground, the closer you get to the ground, the quieter the receive will be. But it will also be rejecting a lot of transmit power just because it's too close to the ground and the ground is going to be absorbing the RF energy. So the other thing to realize is that if you're using an antenna that is a multi-band antenna, you always want, if you intend on NVIS communications, you always want to work the fundamental frequency of that antenna. To show you what I'm talking about, let me take this back up to 30 feet. And now I'm going to turn this into an 80 meter NFIT. I'm just going to double the wire length. Bear with me, it may take a little bit of shuffling to get this the correct length. No, I actually got it pretty close. That's a little low. Let's shorten it just a little bit. I'm shooting for 3.9 megahertz. Still a little bit long. 123 feet is going to be the winner. That's pretty close. I could have lengthened the counterpoise as well, but this is quick and dirty. So, 80 meter NFED. And when we check this at 3.9 megahertz, we're going to see an NVIS pattern that's a golf ball. And it's going to be very good, straight up in the air, 90 degrees. And the gain is pretty decent at 5.75 dBi, which is what we want when we're talking local communications. We want the signal to be straight up in the air. The straighter the better. 90 degrees is perfect. But being an NFED, it's a multi-band antenna. So what happens to this pattern if we run it on 40 meters instead of 80 meters? Well, now we have a problem, because this is no longer a good pattern for NVIS. We're now at 55 degrees, which isn't going to work as well. It will work. You will be able to make contacts with this antenna, but it's not going to be the best solution for contacting local stations for NVIS. So I've mentioned this in previous videos, but the first even harmonic is actually the worst possible pattern on an antenna, because there isn't really any strong points to this pattern. If you look at it for NVIS, it's not going to work very well. And if you come down here at 5 degrees for long distance contacts, you can see the gain is just not very good at all. Not saying it won't work, it will work, but it just isn't going to work well. There'll be antenna configurations that will beat this handily. So if you're looking for NVIS, you want to operate the antenna on its fundamental frequency. In this case, 3.9 megahertz is what this antenna is cut for. So you may be asking, what if I want to do NVIS on 40 meters and 80 meters? Well, there is a solution. I think there's more than one solution. My previous solution was a fan dipole. And fan dipoles work great for that, because you can have an 80 meter wire and trim it perfectly for 80 meters, and then below that put a 40 meter wire and trim that perfectly for 40 meters. And they'll both be half wavelength long antennas, dipoles, that will work perfect on their fundamental frequencies. It's a great solution. But can you do it with a different antenna design? Well, one antenna that I've been experimenting with is an antenna that will work on both 40 meters and 20 meters. And this is it. Okay, so what I've done is I've put a trap in this NFED. You can see the trap right there. This is a 40 meter trap. So this will block 40 meter RF. So in theory, this should allow a 40 meter fundamental waveform to develop on this antenna. And we can check that. Let's go ahead and do a pattern. And yes, you can see that it works just fine on 40 meters. And our gain is more than 6 dBi. Very good for NVIS. Now let's try it at 80 meters. So 3.9 megahertz. And we'll run a pattern again. And now you can see that it uses the entire length of the wire. And it's working on its fundamental. And once again, we have a good NVIS pattern. So the gain is still good, 5.56 dBi. So this is an interesting antenna design. I intend to build this someday. And it only requires one trap and a 49-to-1 balun. And a choke, of course. But this would be fun to experiment with to see if it would actually work in practice rather than the theory that we're looking at now. And the other good thing about it is because it has this trap in here, this trap inductively loads this antenna a bit to make it just a little bit shorter than your typical 80-meter half-wave dipole would be, as I came up with 123 feet. Actually, with the counterpoise, it would be 129.5 feet. So the antenna was 129.5 feet long, and you can see this iteration of this antenna is only 98.5 feet long. So we lost 30 feet, roughly 30 feet off the length of this antenna just by loading it with a trap in the middle. So this might be a good build to do. Now, and interestingly enough, this antenna would also work on 40 meters. And should work quite well. Yeah, so we're only down 2.89 dBi on 40 meters. It's actually better than a vertical. This would be an interesting antenna design to build. So the question, of course, is how do I build the trap? The trap is the only complex thing in this antenna, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So the website that I'm going to use is K7MAM, and I've used this website before. The reason I like using this website is because it gives you basically all the information that you need to make trapped dipole antennas, trapped antennas in general. So here's the good stuff. We can pick a coax. In this case, I'm going to use RG174, a very fine coax. And I'm going to enter the trap frequency here. And for the trap frequency, I want to be below the 40-meter band. So we're going to set this at 7 megahertz on the nose. And then we need some dimensions. Now, typically, lower frequency use traps need to be a little bit bigger diameter than higher frequency traps. So for instance, if I'm making a 28 megahertz trap, I would choose 3/4 as my form size. But since this is a 40-meter trap, I'm going to choose something a little bigger. I'm going to choose 1.5 inches. And then I'm going to come down here and see if those are acceptable numbers. And what you want is the windings on the trap, the length of those windings need to be about the same as the diameter of the form that you're using. So in this case, we have 8 turns of RG174, and we have a coil length of 7/8 of an inch. So we can actually go a little smaller. So let's change this, and we'll take it down to 1.25 inches. Okay, now we have 9.25 turns of RG174, and we have a length of 1 inch. So the coil size is 1.25 inches, and the length on the coil is 1 inch. So this would be very good. This is the size that I think I will build when I finally get around to building this antenna. So the numbers that we need are the capacitance and the inductance, and they list them over here handily for us to write down. So the capacitance in picofarads is 134.2. And then the inductance in microhenries is 3.9. And now let's go ahead and minimize that. We need to come over here. And in EasyNEC, we'll see this L network selection over here. So when we click on that, you can see I've already pre-entered this information. And evidently, when I was looking up coax trap information when I designed this antenna, I was using a different diameter form. You can see the numbers aren't the same. But all you're going to do is you're going to have a junction between two wires in EZ and EC. So you can see the end of wire 1 and the beginning of wire 3 is where we insert the trap. So wire 1 at 100% of the wire, so it's the end of the wire 1, and then wire 3 at the start of wire 3. And you can see in practice it doesn't quite match the numbers that you type in, and that's because of the number of segments that we've chosen. But it's close. 97% and 7% gives us what we want to see. So this R ohms is the actual ohmic resistance of the wire that you're using to build your trap. For theory, all we have to do is put in there 0 ohms, and EZ and EC will change that to short when you hit enter. So now I'm going to come over here. I'm just going to change these numbers to what I come up with, which is 3.9 microhenries and 134.2 picofarads. 3.9 microhenries, 134.2 pico. The frequency of the trap is 7 megahertz, as we determined with the K7MEM website, where we put in the frequency of the trap right here. And we should be done. So right off the bat, I want to see what changed because these numbers are a little different. You can see also over here we have to select trap, series, or parallel. So let's see if the SWR changed at all. And no, we're still in roughly the same ballpark. So the picofarad and the microfarad changed slightly, but we gave up one and added to the other and ended up about in the same place. So you'll also see that I'm using 2450 ohms, a custom impedance value, because that would be the output of our 49-to-1 transformer. And you can enter that here. So if you want to build an NVIS antenna that works perfect on 40 and 80 meters, just build a coax trap that has a 1 1/4 inch form, so 1 1/4 inch PVC pipe that has a diameter of 1.66 inches, and wrap 9 1/4 turns of RG174 on it. And then refer back to my nano VNA video where I converted the nano VNA for use as a grid dip meter. And you can fine tune that trap until it's perfectly resonant, right at 7 megahertz, and then just insert that in line with your wire, and you can build an NVIS antenna that work on 40 and 80 both. Now, when you're building these coax traps, I'll insert links for the videos on coax trap building, but what you want to do is you put the input coming off of your transmitter, so it goes through a section of wire from your transmitter and your feed point, and you're going to put that in the shield of the RG174. And then it's going to wrap around that coil form 9 1/4 times, and then it's going to come out the shield on the other end. And then you're going to bring that shield back and connect it to the center conductor where you put that input at. So now it's going to go through the center conductor 9 1/4 turns and come out the center conductor on the other end, and that continues on down the wire. So the way that a coax trap works is it has to go through that winding twice. So you're using both the shield and the center conductor of the coax for the inductance and the capacitance of the coax trap. So the input is the shield, 9 1/4 turns, connect back to the center conductor and make it go through that 9 1/4 turns again. And then it comes out the center conductor on the other end. And that's the simplest way to do a coax trap. There are other ways to do it, but that seems to be the way that works best. So coax traps are easy to build. They're rugged. You can spray paint them to make them lay down so that they don't move around. They tend to drift a little bit sometimes with age. I've had them drift before, but If you start low on frequency, any drifting that you may have will drift it higher in frequency and the antenna will still work. So this is on my list of antennas to build. We'll get to this one someday. I still want to do the loop build first. So hopefully we can get that started pretty soon. I'm having an issue figuring out a way to get around an oak tree in my backyard, because when I go to pull the wire up, it's going to snag in the limbs of the oak tree. So I might have to make a square loop instead of a triangular loop. We're still working on that. But I just wanted to go over NVIS. It seems to be a misunderstood concept, and it really doesn't have to be. You're probably using NVIS right now and don't even know it. You're not aware of it. There are ways to improve NVIS propagation with an antenna design that's optimized for that mode of propagation. So there you have it. If you have any questions, just throw them in the comments down below. And thanks for watching.